Greetings and welcome to Lobes and Robes, How Neuroscience Can Change the World. This podcast is sponsored by the American University Center for Neuroscience and Behavior and explores the links between neuroscience and key policy questions today. I'm Susan Carl, a professor of law at American University Washington College of Law, and I will help lead discussions throughout our series. My co-host is Dr. Colin Saldana, a professor of neuroscience at American University. He is also the director of the American University Center for Neuroscience and Behavior and the president-elect of the Society for Behavioral Neuroendocrinology. This podcast is for anyone interested in how scientific discovery can make the world a better place. Thanks for listening.
Our guest today is Dr. Adriana Galvan, who is a professor of psychology at UCLA with expertise in adolescent brain development. She received her BA from Barnard College, Columbia University, and her PhD in neuroscience from the Weill Cornell College School of Medicine. She is the director of the Developmental Neuroscience Laboratory at UCLA. The focus of her research is on characterizing the neural mechanisms underlying adolescent behavior, with an eye towards informing policy. Her research is funded by the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, the Russell Sage Foundation, and the Jacobs Foundation. Her work addresses the following questions. How do developmental changes in the brain subserve characteristic adolescent behaviors like decision-making, reward sensitivity, and learning? What is the role of context in dynamic behavioral and neurobiological changes across adolescence? And how do neural changes differ between typically and atypically developing adolescents? She has over 100 publications, including a book, The Neuroscience of Adolescence by Cambridge University Press, and is the recipient of many awards, including the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, the National Academy of Sciences Troland Award, and the American Psychological Association's Early Career Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award. Dr. Galvan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome, and I'll start with the first question. I think our listeners often want to know a little bit about your background, your career, and especially how you came to your special interest in the adolescent brain.
Thank you. It's actually quite simple. I became interested in adolescence because I loved being an adolescent. I loved this period of life where I felt more independent and I was learning new skills like driving and having a job. And I just really enjoyed that sense of freedom I started to experience during adolescence. And after college, I went to graduate school and learned that there wasn't much research on the adolescent brain. There had been a lot of research on earlier childhood and understanding how postnatal development supports our ability to acquire new skills and to learn how to bond with caregivers and a new language. But there wasn't much known about why adolescents behave the way they do. And so that started my interest and my career in adolescent brain development.
Adriana, you know that I have some interest in hormones and sex differences. And so one of the things that you note is that the average age of puberty is getting earlier and earlier. What are the best understandings about why that is? And what are the implications of those changes for the development of the adolescent's brain?
Yeah. So there are a few theories or speculations about why puberty seems to have an earlier onset. And some of those involve nutrition and our changing patterns of eating behaviors or hormones in our foods that we eat. Stress level contributes to the onset of puberty. So those factors may contribute, but another factor is that we just have better measurement of puberty, whereas in previous generations, we may have only used secondary sex characteristics as a marker for puberty, such as breast development or pubic hair, for example, we now know that puberty starts even before we can see the physical attributes of puberty. And so our more precise measurements of hormones circulating in the body, for example, help us identify that puberty starts earlier than we previously thought. So it's both probably a combination of environmental factors and diet, but also the measurement and precision of measurement that we now have. And in answer to your question about the implications for brain development, we know that when puberty strikes, the hormones that are released in the brain have implications for activating the brain changes that happen during adolescence. So, for example, there's an interaction between the hormone levels that are associated with puberty and greater engagement of social brain regions. So, brain regions that help us pay attention to another person's facial expression or to read other people's emotional cues, for example. It also has ramifications for our reward system. So there's a strong interaction between pubertal hormones and reward sensitivity in the brain. And so those two things are going to be amplified when we start having more circulating pubertal hormones in the brain. And then the last thing I'll say about an earlier onset of puberty is that this elongates the period of adolescence. Currently, we think we don't know the precise boundaries, but adolescence starts around age 10 or 11 or 12 when puberty strikes, and it extends into the early 20s when the brain stops developing and starts aging. And so this elongation of puberty means that we have a developmental period that is 10 or 15 years as opposed to 8 years, which is what we previously thought.
Thank you.
That's fascinating. And you say that the brain is continuing to develop to the early 20s. Is there a part of the brain that takes longer to develop? And what are the implications of that?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yes, we know that the prefrontal cortex shows the most protracted development, so it develops last. The brain in general develops from the back to the front, to be simplistic about it. In the back of the brain are parts that help us do very basic things like breathing or motor development, and we need those things early in life. But the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in emotion regulation, planning for the future, understanding abstract concepts, those executive function skills we don't need right when we're born. And so it makes sense that those continue to develop with experience throughout adolescence. And the implications of this are that we have greater plasticity during this time in life. So we have a large wave of plasticity right after we're born. And then adolescence is characterized by a second wave of plasticity. And this makes sense because we need our brains to be flexible and responsive to the environment, because during adolescence, it's ever-changing. There's a changing social landscape. There's a change in the skills we acquire. There's a change in our relationships with people. And so our brains support us through the plasticity that it affords us during that time.
I can see how that's really helpful in some ways. But in other ways, are there some downsides to not having a fully developed prefrontal cortex and giving one good judgment and planning and that kind of thing?
Yeah, it makes us a little bit more fearless, some more than others, and it makes us explore the world in ways that as adults maybe we wouldn't feel so comfortable exploring because we know that there are consequences. And so for some young people, it can get them into trouble, but for most of us, adolescence and the plasticity and the delayed development of the prefrontal cortex gives us the opportunity to take on new adventures, and we all need that. And it's actually no coincidence that the brain shows this prolonged development of the regulation systems in the brain. We're not the only species on Earth, actually, to show this prolonged development and greater risk-taking or exploratory behavior. All animals that have been studied, whether it's mice or rats or monkeys, they all show the same behavior during adolescence that's attributed to hormones and changes in the brain.
Again, that's really just so incredibly fascinating. I have a sort of geeky law question. As I was reading your work, it occurred to me that even though in some ways law has really not been able to make good use of neuroscience findings that well, but around these questions about the rate and the nature of adolescent brain development and the way adolescents really don't have the full moral capacity, it seems to me that that's an area where law really has paid attention to neuroscience findings. So that this is one example of a real success in law and neuroscience speaking to each other. And I'm wondering, do you have any thoughts on what accounts for that success?
Yeah. It's been a great partnership between the legal system and justice system and neuroscience. As you say, this is one of those wins where the bench science, so to speak, and the science that happens in the laboratories has been translated into conversations in the legal system. And I've been very fortunate to be a part of some of those conversations. And I think one of the reasons is because there was such interest in understanding whether this age of 18 or the age of majority in this country was arbitrary or aligned with what we know about the adolescent brain and behavior. What can we expect a person at 17 or 18 who's been convicted of criminal behavior? What can we expect them to do in this moment? And how might the science of adolescence inform us about what sanctions are most appropriate for an individual? And it's coming back to that question of plasticity, knowing that the brain continues to change and develop in response to experience has really been of interest to judges and to legal scholars I've worked with, because they want to know, when does an adolescent become an adult? And when should we be treating young people as adults in the justice system? And there's actually been recent research showing that although the age of majority is 18, we know that 19, 20, and 21-year-olds, when we look at their brain and the emotional decisions that they make, their brains behave more like a younger brain than an older brain. And that's been influential in a recent Massachusetts Supreme Court ruling examining and questioning whether someone who was 19 when they were convicted of a heinous crime should be treated or continue to be treated as an adult.
I'm going to follow this with another geeky question.
Go ahead.
And this is, in your more recent papers, you talk about developmental evolutionary theory. Could you give us an idea of what that is? And I have a follow-up question after.
Okay. Well, it's the notion that our brains are, it means several different things, but in this case, in particular with the questions about behaviors and culpability and things like that, it's related to how the brain is designed or is responsive to our current environment in a particular way. So during adolescence, we have a very special developmental needs. We often think about the needs of a young baby, for example. They need to be loved, they need to be attended to, they need to hear language in order to develop that language. Well, adolescents don't need those basic things, but they have different developmental needs, such as respect from adults, the opportunity to have social engagement, the opportunity to learn new skills and to practice their decision-making. That's all related to the needs adolescents have, and their brains support those needs.
Got it. The follow-up question I have is, what are the benefits of using developmental evolutionary theory as a lens for making sense of what the study of neuroscience of the adolescent brain can show us?
Yeah, that's a great question. From my perspective, it helps us understand, coming back to that original question I had when I started graduate school, why do adolescents behave the way adolescents behave? It's in part because that helps us understand how the adolescent brain or the adolescent person perceives the world that may be quite distinct from the way adults do. So, for example, we often think of adolescents taking unnecessary risks or reflect on, why would they have done that, knowing that there are these, ramifications. But from an adolescent's perspective, their behavior may be quite rational if taking that risk afforded them or earned them some social status, for example, or social capital. And so seen from that perspective, it helps us maybe not agree with the behavior, but to better understand and support them in the aftermath.
Understood. So I'm not a parent myself, but I can imagine that risk-taking behavior in your children is not something that all parents would be very happy with. But you talk about risk-taking as a good thing.
Yeah.
Why is the adolescent taste for risk a good thing?
Great question. The adolescent taste for risk is a good thing because we need members of our species to be able and willing and interested in taking risks. Because risk-taking is one way of framing it, but also another way of framing that behavior is of trial and error learning. We learn by doing. And sometimes we do something without knowing what the outcome is going to be, and that's the definition of risk. So when we're earlier in life, most of what we learn is through trial and error, which involves taking risks. So, for example, I have an 8-month-old niece, and she's learning how to crawl and, a little bit how to walk. And all of that has to happen through taking a risk, right? She's taking a risk and taking a step. And there's no other way for her to learn that behavior other than falling about 100 times a day is what an average falling behavior of a baby is. And we don't see that as a risk-taking behavior. We see that as learning. In adolescence, we shift the frame to call it risk-taking. And indeed it is, because as adults, we know that negative consequences can ensue and sometimes do. But they are exploring their world in a way that eventually internalizes confidence in themselves to make good decisions. And I mentioned earlier that the prefrontal cortex continues to develop into the early to mid-20s. And it develops in partnership with the experiences we provide that prefrontal cortex. There needs to be something to react to for that prefrontal cortex to practice its good decision-making skills.
Got it. That makes total sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
That really resonates so much with my experience with adolescence. And it sort of explains why we should say to our kids, go ahead and try things, even if we sort of know they're probably not going to work out, so they can test for themselves. Right. You also say in some of your recent publications, which I so enjoyed reading, you focus on plasticity and the really intense interest of adolescents in social interactions and their peers. And I'm wondering what that's about in terms of adolescent brain development. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. All humans are very social creatures, and more so perhaps during adolescence. And in part, it's because this is when our world starts to expand. It makes perfect sense that we are interested in others socially. We learn through social means, often learning in a classroom or outside the classroom best happens when we're doing it with others, and in particular, others that we enjoy spending time with. But particular changes in the brain that help us pay attention to social cues are really important, because that there again is something that we learn by doing. It's very challenging to didactically instruct someone in how to have a dialogue, for example. You kind of have to learn how to do it by engaging in a dialogue with other people. And we learn a lot about how to interact with people outside of our family group when we're adolescents. We start to spend time with our friends' parents or other people's homes. We start to realize that not everyone sees the world the way that we do. And those skills of gaining social intuition, of reading other people's faces, it becomes sharply increased during adolescence, in part because we spend so much time with other people who are not our family or close friends or close family friends. And often as adults, we dismiss a little bit the importance of hanging out, of the social time that adolescents gravitate towards, but that's serving a very useful purpose for then establishing social skills that, of course, will follow them and be necessary throughout their lives. We know that after you graduate from college and employers really value individuals who have good social skills, who are not only polite, but can really read a room, so to speak. And all of that skill building happens or starts to happen mostly during adolescence. So I think there's such important information that we get from our hanging out with our friends phase of life.
Absolutely. And I'm wondering, sometimes with adolescents I've known, I've kind of wished they might be a little more different from their peers, a little, in terms of how they choose to dress and what their interests are and that kind of thing. Yeah. And so what about how conformist adolescents are? I sometimes have wanted to say to adolescents I know or have known, why don't you think for yourself a little bit instead of just going along with what your friends are doing? And when do adolescents start distinguishing themselves from the rest of the crowd?
Yes, it's such a good question. And it's so interesting because during adolescence, there's this interesting tension between wanting to fit in and wanting to stand out, right? And so we all want to be individuals, and yet we all dress alike and listen to the same music and things like that. I think about it more about how adolescents do certainly follow the same trends and do all, that's why we can identify trends from the 80s and 90s and every time, because it's the young people who adopt and promote those trends. In part, it's a way for them to isolate themselves, not from each other, but from adults. Because adolescents immediately tell you if you're not supposed to, as an adult, if you're not supposed to be wearing what they wear or something like that. Or once adults adopt a behavior that adolescents had, the adolescents drop it. So one good example is Facebook. So Facebook initially started as just adolescents were on the Facebook, on the platform. And now that many adults are on Facebook, the adolescents are less interested in the platform, right? So it's a way to distinguish their own developmental identity from those who are younger than them and those who are older than them. And to your question about when that individuation comes in, that does start to happen. And this is part of the end of brain development time in the early to mid-20s. People start to have more of their own sense of values or what they care about. In part, maybe they've gone to college and identified a major or something they really care about, or they've started work in a place that's exposed them to new ideas that are distinct from their friends. And so as adolescents start to spend more time with adults, they are older adults, they're more likely to start individuating their own thoughts and beliefs.
Adriana, one of the things that I have noticed, being an uncle, is that a lot of kids nowadays happen to be growing up at a very, very uncertain time. And I have a niece, for example, who was a senior in high school when COVID hit and therefore missed a high school graduation. And she was also, incidentally, at Barnard College 4 years later,
wow.
during when Columbia University shut down graduations. And so she was devastated. She was absolutely devastated because two of the biggest things that had happened to her until then, she just didn't have any reference was.
Yeah.
How do you think this uncertainty affects the development of the adolescent brain?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And congratulations to your niece for going to Barnard. As you know, it's my alma mater, and I absolutely loved every second. I loved it. I loved it. But yeah, that uncertainty can't be ignored because we do live in very uncertain times, and ever more so when, by definition, we don't know what's going to happen next or when we're not going to get to mark those milestones like your niece didn't get to. And uncertainty is quite interesting because irrespective of political uncertainty, for example, or circumstantial uncertainty, the adolescent brain is actually really good at absorbing uncertainty, of pivoting. And that's part of that proclivity towards risk-taking and being comfortable with not knowing what's going to come next. That's an attribute of adolescence. But yet, over time, when, for example, your niece keeps experiencing things that are unpleasant and takes away particular milestones for her, that uncertainty can lead to anxiety in some young people. Indeed, there's an uptick in anxiety among adolescents. In the 90s, the number one or prevailing mental health disorder was depression, and now that has shifted to be anxiety among people between the ages of 16 to 24. I don't think it's a coincidence that it's because we live in a time when there are a lot of events that are anxiety-provoking. And so the adolescent brain is, of course, paying attention. As kids become adolescents, they're more aware of what's happening in the world and what it may mean for them. And so hopefully we're on a decline of the number of cases of anxiety, but certainly it has had an impact in that regard. Sometimes folks say that perhaps the increase in anxiety among adolescents is due to social media, but that's not taking into consideration the entire picture of all the world events and circumstances that likely contribute to these feelings of anxiety. It's not just social media.
So the social media stuff, I think of it as an increase in sort of the background noise of what's going on. Is that a fair evaluation, or do you have something else that you think about it?
That's an interesting way to think about it. I hadn't heard it phrased that way, but yeah, it's one of many things that they are exposed to. And so I think I like the way you frame it because it's not simply saying that that's the only place where they give their attention to, because sometimes that's the narrative, and that's not true. Adolescents are still engaging in co-curricular things, playing after-school sports, having after-school jobs. It's not simply that they're only doing social media, but it does contribute to a different dimension of social life, for example, or a different dimension of information. And some folks worry that it's having a negative ramification, but the data actually don't point to that. Anecdotally, we might say my child spends too much time on social media, and I know a lot of parents feel that way, but a lot of studies haven't found a link between a causation of social media causing mental health issues. That's not been determined.
I'm wondering about the perception that's widely held among people who work with young adults in university settings, for example. Yeah, that there really is an uptick in mental health issues among adolescents and young adults. What are your thoughts about the narrative that our young generation is not faring as well as other generations?
Yeah, I think that narrative is overblown. I think that I always wonder, and I'm actually curious to hear from you, what gives you that impression that that young kids are not, or young adults are not faring as well as previous generations?
Yes, I think this is really very interesting, and I want to ask you about this. So I'm wondering how much of it is that there really is a greater problem, and how much of it is that this current generation, yeah, has been sort of given a different vocabulary to talk about mental health. So I'll give an example from my own experience.
Right.
I'll have a student who will schedule an appointment with me, and then they'll email at the last minute and say, I'm so sorry I can't meet with you. I need a
Yeah.
mental health day. And what I really want to say to them is, look, you're in professional school. You really need to just get on with it and take care of your obligations and show
Right.
up for the meeting you schedule with me. I don't know how much of it is that this is what students have been taught to pay attention to their emotional state.
Exactly. And that's exactly why I feel that it's overblown, and that I do think it's a naming vocabulary. And you're right. I felt the same. Growing up, I wouldn't have thought to say I need to tap out for a day because I'm not into it today. Like we all felt that way. And I wouldn't have characterized myself as unhappy in general. I just would have said I didn't feel like it that day. But there is a movement to try to help young people be more precise in their language. So, for example, instead of saying, I'm just anxious, how about saying I'm nervous about something? It's okay to be nervous. It doesn't mean you're anxious about it. And so that, rather than going to the extreme and sending a signal that you're in more distress than you are, is probably not helpful. For example, in my work, I work with a lot of young people, and when I'm meeting with them, I try to set the stage and say, please don't speak in superlatives because it makes it challenging for me to know what you really mean. And I really mean that. And I do think it's generational. When someone says that was the worst ever, I really want to know, was it really the worst, or was that just not the best? Not great. So I do wonder a little bit about language and how, and coming back to trends, there aren't just fashion trends or media trends that young people adopt, but often it's language trends that actually make it challenging to translate across for those of us who are older and don't know what they really mean. So that would be an interesting study, wouldn't it? Are you really not doing well, or is it just the way you speak about it that makes it hard to know?
You just reminded me, Adriana. So I grew up in Bombay and I learned my English from people who had been educated in the UK. And all my training in the language, in English, was very, very British in nature. And I noticed about 15 years ago that people were using words that were, as you said, superlative.
Yes.
And I noticed, there was a song on Broadway that said, everything is awesome.
Yeah.
There was right? So that word awesome
Yeah.
sort of caught me by surprise. And then I started paying attention, and it's true.
Yeah.
There are a lot of things apparently that are epic.
Yes.
Apparently. And being from my training,
Uh-huh.
I didn't know if I was responding to it reasonably or I was just getting old.
Exactly.
And, get off my lawn. This is not epic. You haven't lived long enough to have witnessed epics. Things like that. So I do think there is something to what you're saying about the influence of language.
Yes.
And I can totally understand why it would make it difficult to deal with emotional and therapeutic issues.
That's
because
right.
you don't really know how the person's feeling.
You
if
don't
they
really
talk in
know-
superlatives all the time.
Exactly. You don't really know how the person is feeling. And language is meaningful. There's, a lot of research showing the relation between language and cognition. If you say it a certain way, you feel it a certain way, so
Yes.
anyway, it's just, I do think a lot about that. And on the other hand, doesn't matter. If they're expressing that they're doing worse, then maybe that's what we should really be paying attention to rather than how they're expressing it. But this is where I get twirled around because I really try to disentangle that, because if it's not the case that young people are faring worse in this generation than previous ones, are we then just stuck on this narrative that actually doesn't help them, right? That then we turn into a culture of just almost of care that doesn't acknowledge their own ability to be independent, to, as you said, Susan, just get on with it. Like, just pull yourself out. Like, are we not providing that kind of framing because we're worried about offending them or something? I don't know.
Right.
Mhm.
On that question, and of course, this is just a layperson's impression, but I do worry sometimes that we are asking children to grow up very quickly with social media, internet access, so that kids end up seeing things that are not developmentally appropriate. And I'm wondering about your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think about this, and this is where I think about it more as a parent. I have a 14-year-old, and I didn't let him have a phone until he was, actually this year recently, and he was, I think, the last child in his class to get a phone. And so I say all that to say, oh, it's not all social media, and of course they're okay and everything, but it would be naive to not consider the exposure they get that we previously didn't in other generations. And so,
Yes.
as with any new technology, there is exposure. And this is why, rather than shying away from, for example, banning social media on the extreme, social media is not going away, in part because adults don't want it to go away. We're not going to give up our phone and smartphones and all that. And so we need to establish how we can support and scaffold the use of social media for especially younger adolescents. In the same way we scaffold any new skill like driving or sexual behavior, we recognize that information is more helpful than ignoring it and then throwing them out into whatever that behavior is, including, like I said, social media or sex or driving or something like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And of course, sometimes it's very hard to protect adolescents. So I'm going to give you one example. I know someone who put in place all of the safety controls and protective technology for her kid on the internet, and then learned years later that her kid,
Oh my gosh.
had installed an alternative operating system on their computer and was busily visiting the dark web without her knowing anything about it. So sometimes I think as parents,
the example that you give is a perfect one, because one of the challenges and why I think as adults and parents we worry so much about it is that they're actually better at it than we are, right? Like, they have more information, and that's what's really frightening is, what am I missing simply because I'm not well versed in this technology? And that's what I think about.
I know we're coming close to wrapping up here, but could you tell us where you're headed in your work?
Yeah.
And what the priorities are in the near future?
Thank you. Yeah, for the question. Yeah, one of my priorities is, and maybe you picked this up from the readings, is that I want to shift the narrative about adolescence. I think that adolescents have a lot to offer. It's not a coincidence we have this period of life, and it's rich with opportunities. All of us, at some point in our lives, took risks to become the academics we are, and go to college and leave Bombay and all those things. And so, how can we recapture that spirit and appreciation for adolescents while also being mindful that they are living in a changing world that is much more uncertain than what we were reared in? And so, how do we balance both promoting them and helping them become autonomous, but also recognizing that they do need scaffolding that we maybe didn't need in the same way? And then, just a pet project, I'm really interested in romantic relationships in adolescence. We don't know enough about them and the involvement of the changing brain in that. And romantic relationships are so important. And again, sometimes as adults, we dismiss them a little bit, but there's a lot to be learned and there's a lot to support, because this is also new territory for young people. And so, rather than dismissing it and assuming they'll find their own way, and of course they do, sometimes they do need some support there.
That sounds absolutely fantastic.
As you say that, I'm reminded of all the discussions going on about AI and kid friendships and romantic partnerships. And
that's right. It needs attention. That's exactly right. So,
thank you so much for this really fascinating
thank you.
Discussion.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate the questions. Those are really terrific. And I enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, that's it for this podcast episode. Thanks very much for listening. And as always, we welcome your feedback at neuroscience.policy@american.edu. We hope you'll join us again for our next episode, and do let us know if there's anything in particular you'd like to hear more about.